On January 5th, 1757, a turbulent Frenchman named Robert François Damiens stepped forward and plunged a small penknife into the leg of King Louis XV of France. Now, while this might sound like something that could have been lifted right out of Shakespeare's Richard III, the truth is that this was no mere dagger thrust. In fact, it was a blatant assassination attempt. The king was nearly killed, and even though the wound itself was relatively minor, it would end up resulting in the last man in France being torn apart by horses. Want to hear more? Well, feast your eyes on today's episode of Fake History. Robert XV had been ruling France since 1715, enjoying all the spoils of power and privilege that came along with being a Bourbon. But if there was one thing the Bourbon dynasty knew how to do, it was make enemies. In fact, at the time of this story, they had quite a few. There was Madame de Pompadour, the king's mistress, who had risen to such power that she was now directing the country's finances and foreign affairs. Then there was the clergy, who were angry that the king had given the title of almoner to his mistress. And then there was the populace, who were tired of the king's constant wars and the taxes needed to pay for them. So when Robert François Damiens attacked the king, he wasn't doing so in a vacuum. There was a lot of resentment towards the monarchy brewing in the streets of France. Now, as far as assassination attempts go, Damiens was hardly the most impressive. He didn't poison the king or set off a bomb in his carriage or even shoot him from the shadows. No. Instead, he attacked the king in broad daylight as he rode through the streets of Paris. Now, luckily for Robert XV, the blade of Damiens' knife was dull, and the attack only managed to leave a small gash on his leg. However, as an attack on the person of the king, it was considered an act of sacrilege. At the time, kings were seen as the literal representatives of God on earth, and an assault on their person was seen as an assault on the divine order itself. Therefore, no matter the intent, the punishment for attacking a king was always the same. Damiens was immediately thrown in prison, and the king's torturers got to work extracting a confession from the would-be assassin. They wanted to know if he had accomplices, and if there was any way that the king himself could be avenged. Now, we don't know exactly what Damiens said during his torture, but we do know that he claimed he acted alone. That's why on February, he was sentenced to the punishment of the king's regicide. Basically, the royal executioners would get their way, and he would become the last person in France to be torn apart by horses. There's some debate as to whether or not Damiens chose this fate himself or if it was imposed upon him. But either way, the preparations began immediately. The following month, on March, Damiens was transferred to the infamous prison of La Force, where he was stripped naked and examined by two doctors. They noted that he was well built and in good health, which was unsurprising considering that just a few weeks prior, he had managed to escape Paris by evading the city's guards and riding a horse for 8 straight days. Then, after being retrained and re-examined, he was led to a windowless cell where he would spend his last 2 days alive. On March, Damiens was woken early in the morning and prepared for his journey to the Place de Grève, the very spot in Paris where public executions used to take place. As he walked through the streets, He was chained between two soldiers, and the entire city seemed to be watching him. In fact, news of his upcoming execution spread so quickly that by the time he reached the square, a crowd of over 10,000 people was waiting to watch him die. Now, back then, public executions weren't really a new or shocking thing. In fact, they were kind of expected. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, burning, pressing, drowning, and impalement were all common ways to put criminals to death. And believe it or not, these punishments were considered humane, almost educational. It was thought that executing someone in public was necessary to deter others from committing crimes. Plus, seeing someone die was a great way to liven up your Tuesday. Nevertheless, while executions weren't shocking, what happened next was beyond gruesome. Damon was placed on a platform. A velvet cushion was placed under him, and he was asked to sit down. From there, one of the king's counselors read him a summary of his crimes, after which the executioner approached him with a red-hot pair of pincers. Without warning, he opened them wide and clamped them onto Damon's face, digging his sharp metal teeth into his nose and ripping it clean off. Blood flowed freely from his face and mixed with the dust of the ground. As the executioner continued tearing chunks of flesh from his cheeks, his ears, and his forehead. With every movement, the crowds cheered wildly, hungry for more gore. Once his face was completely disfigured, the executioner moved to his chest and began tearing away his shirt. Then, once that was finished, he returned to the crowd, threw the bloody pincers into the air, and caught them. At that moment, the crowd understood what was going to happen next. He picked up a small hatchet and handed it to another executioner. Then, without another word, that executioner cut the ropes that bound Damon to the platform and held him securely in place. Next, they tied one end of a rope to a nearby post, looped it over his right foot, and pulled it taut. As he screamed in agony, they pulled the rope until his foot was ripped clean from his ankle. Then they did the same to his left foot. Once both feet were free, they dropped a second rope into the pit and did the same to his left hand. Then they did the same to his right hand. But the worst was yet to come. The executioners then dragged him back to the center of the square and tied each of his limbs to a separate horse. Two were white and two were black, and they were adorned with ribbons in the colors of the French royal family. To everyone watching, it must have looked like the executioners were about to conduct some sort of bizarre equestrian ballet. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. The men shouted, "Long live the king," and then they whipped the horses. They strained against their harnesses and pulled in for different directions, literally tearing Damien's body apart. As they pulled, his shoulders were dislocated and his legs were broken. And although it's never mentioned in any of the accounts of this execution, it's likely that several ribs were also cracked and punctured his lungs. Still, they kept pulling until his entire body was split open. All the while, he continued screaming and begging for it to stop. But the executioners paid him no heed. Instead, they watched with amusement as the horses tore his insides out and spat them onto the ground. However, after a few minutes, they noticed that the horses were struggling to tear his body apart. And that's because Damon's ligaments and tendons were stronger than the horses, at least on their own. So the executioners decided to help them. They tied the remaining ropes around the horse's hooves and tightened them until the animal's jaws were forced open. Then one of them grabbed a handful of straw and stuffed it inside the gaping holes. And when he did that, the horses shook their heads violently, causing their jaws to snap shut and crush the bones in Damon's body. That is, of course, until one of them broke and they all started running around the square in circles. By that point, Damon's entire torso was hanging loosely from his arms, and his legs and buttocks were barely attached to his hips. After a few moments, the executioners coaxed the horses back into position and signaled for them to pull again. This time, Damon's right arm was torn from its socket, followed shortly thereafter by his left arm. His body was finally split completely open and hung by a single thread. But still the horses kept pulling until they had literally torn him to pieces. Finally, the executioners yelled, "Hold!" and the horses stopped. The 4 pieces of Damien's body were thrown into a giant bonfire that had been constructed in the center of the square. Then his ashes were thrown into the wind to make sure that there was nothing left of him to be reclaimed. So there you have it, the last man torn apart by horses in France. Now, while we don't know much about Robert François Damiens, we do know that his execution had a lasting impact on Europe. In fact, the whole affair would later be cited by Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria as proof that the legal systems of Europe needed a drastic overhaul. This execution helped bring about the end of torture and the death penalty in many countries. In fact, it's often referred to as a major turning point in the history of capital punishment. As for the Damiens family, they were cursed forever. They were exiled from France, forced to change their name, and never allowed to return. While this story is a terrible example of the lengths the old regime would go to keep its power, it's important to remember that this kind of judicial murder wasn't unique to France. In fact, across Europe and even in America, thousands of people would be publicly executed for crimes against the state. These kinds of punishments were meant to instill fear and obedience, but they ultimately failed. And today we look back on them as nothing more than a barbaric chapter in human history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.